David unlocked the door with his own key, the familiar creak of the hinges welcoming him home. The warm scent of freshly baked pastries filled the air, reminding him of his childhood. His mother, Laura, stood at the stove, flipping golden brown turnovers in a pan. She had always loved to cook, especially for him. David paused in the doorway, feeling the weight of the news he was about to deliver. "Mom, I'm home," he called out, his voice steady, though inside, his heart pounded. Laura looked over her shoulder, smiling warmly. "David, sweetheart, you're just in time. I made your favorite apple turnovers." "How'd the exam go?" David shoved his hands into his pockets, a nervous habit he hadn't shaken since high school. "Yeah, I passed," he muttered, but then quickly added, "But I have something more important to tell you." His mother's brow furrowed slightly as she turned down the heat on the stove, giving him her full attention. "More important than passing your exam? Well, this sounds serious." David swallowed, feeling the moment hang heavy between them. "It is." He ran a hand through his sandy hair, a nervous grin breaking through. "I'm getting married." For a split second, Laura froze, the spatula in her hand suspended midair. She quickly recovered, setting it down and turning to face him fully. Her hands, slightly trembling, disappeared into the pockets of her apron as she forced a smile. "Married? Oh, David, that's big news. Who is she?" "Her name's Emily," David said, his face lighting up as he spoke. "I've mentioned her before. We met at the university. Mom, she's amazing, and she's pregnant." The room seemed to still. Laura's smile wavered, though she tried to keep her expression calm. The word pregnant echoed in her mind. It was too fast, too sudden. They hadn't even been together that long, had they? Laura nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. "Pregnant, I see." She turned back to the stove, more to buy herself a moment to collect her thoughts than to check on the pastries. "Well, I suppose congratulations are in order," she added softly, though there was a tension in her voice she couldn't quite hide. "When did you decide this?" David, sensing her hesitation, but not quite understanding it, took a step closer. "We've been talking about it for a while, Mom. I know it seems fast, but I love her. She's everything I've been looking for." Laura's hands tightened around the edge of the counter. "David, I'm happy for you," she said, though the words felt heavy, forced. This is a lot to take in. You've been together for what, a few months?" David nodded, his tone insistent. 6 months, but we're sure. I'm sure, Mom." There was a pause, the kind that weighed down the room. Laura turned to face him again, searching his eyes. "Are you sure this is what you want?" "Marriage is a big step, David. And a baby. You're still in school." "I know," David said, a little defensively. "But we can handle it. I'll get a better job, and Emily's finishing her degree too. We've got this." Laura sighed, feeling a tightness in her chest. She could see how determined he was, but she also knew how quickly life could change. She had raised him on her own, after all. "I just don't want you to rush into anything you're not ready for." David's expression softened. "I'm not rushing, Mom. Emily and I talked it through. She's great, you'll see. We're going to make this work." Laura nodded, though doubt still gnawed at her. She forced herself to smile again. "Okay, sweetheart, if this is what you want, then I'm with you." David grinned, relief washing over him. "Thanks, Mom. I knew you'd understand." Laura turned back to the stove, flipping the pastries with careful precision. She didn't want him to see the worry etched on her face. "Why don't you wash up? We can sit down and talk over some turnovers." David smiled again and disappeared down the hall. Alone in the kitchen, Laura leaned against the counter, her hands trembling more than before. She had always dreamed of watching her son grow up, settle down, and find happiness. But not like this. It was all happening so fast. Too fast. As the smell of the warm pastries filled the kitchen, Laura whispered to herself, "Please, let me be wrong about this." The next morning, Laura stood in the living room, nervously glancing out the window every few minutes. The sky was overcast, and there was a damp chill in the air, setting the mood for the uneasy feeling that had been building in her chest since David had made his announcement. A loud knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. She opened it to see David standing there, a beaming smile on his face. Beside him was Emily, clutching the handle of a large suitcase. Laura's heart sank when she saw it. She knew this wasn't just a visit. This was permanent. "Mom, we're here," David said enthusiastically, pulling the suitcase into the apartment. Emily gave a shy smile, tucking a strand of her blonde hair behind her ear. Her hand rested gently on her stomach, emphasizing the small but noticeable bump. "Hi, Mrs. Jacobs," Emily said quietly, her voice tentative. "Thank you for letting me stay." Laura forced a smile, her mind racing. "Of course, Emily. Welcome. Welcome to our home." She stepped aside, watching as David rolled the suitcase down the hall toward his old room. Emily stood awkwardly by the door for a moment, clearly unsure of what to say. "I hope it's not too much trouble," she added, her voice laced with uncertainty. "I didn't want to impose." Laura shook her head, her voice gentle but firm. "No trouble at all, Emily. You're family now." The words felt strange coming out of her mouth, but she knew she had to say them. David returned, grinning. "Mom, I was thinking we could move some of my stuff out of the room so Emily has more space." Laura nodded, trying to keep the tightness in her chest from surfacing. "Sure, honey. I can help you clear some things out." David turned to Emily. "Why don't you go check out the room? Make yourself comfortable. I'll help Mom with the rest." Emily nodded, her smile a little brighter now. "Thanks, David." She disappeared down the hallway, and the door to David's room clicked shut. Laura exhaled, the weight of the situation settling in as she and David began moving boxes out of the room. As they carried the first load toward the living room, Laura finally spoke. "David, are you sure this is what you want?" she asked, her voice low but steady. She glanced over at him as they set the boxes down. David sighed, clearly frustrated. "Mom, we've talked about this. I'm sure. I know it's fast, but Emily's the one. We're going to be a family." Laura looked down at the floor, not wanting to push too hard, but she couldn't help herself. "I just worry. You're both so young. And this," she gestured toward the room, "it's a lot of change." David rubbed the back of his neck, a flicker of doubt crossing his face before he pushed it away. "I get it, Mom, but we love each other, and we've got it all planned out. I'm working more hours, and once the baby comes, we'll figure things out." Laura bit her lip. She didn't want to argue, but the nagging sense of unease wouldn't leave her. "You know you'll always have my support, but don't forget, this is a big step. It's not just about love, it's about responsibility." David stopped moving boxes and faced her. "Mom, I know you're worried, but this is my decision. I want to be there for Emily and our baby. Please, just trust me on this." Laura nodded slowly, forcing herself to step back. She didn't want to be the overbearing mother who pushed him away. "Okay, David, I trust you," she said softly, though her heart still ached with worry. They worked in silence after that, the sound of boxes being shifted filling the room. When they had cleared enough space in the bedroom, Laura stepped back to let David and Emily settle in. As the afternoon wore on, Laura busied herself in the kitchen, her hands moving on autopilot as she prepared dinner. She heard the occasional muffled conversation from David's room, but mostly it was quiet. Too quiet. By the time dinner was ready, Laura felt the tension building again. She called out, "David, Emily, dinner's ready." David appeared first, with Emily following slowly behind. Emily seemed tired, her face pale and drawn, but she smiled politely as she sat down at the table. Laura placed a casserole dish in the center of the table and forced a smile. "I hope you're hungry. I made baked ziti." David eagerly served himself, but Emily hesitated. "Thank you, Mrs. Jacobs," she said, "but I'm not feeling too well. The baby, morning sickness has been rough." Laura's eyes flicked toward Emily's still small belly, and though she said nothing, the nagging doubts crept back in. "Of course, Emily. You don't have to eat if you're not up for it," she said kindly. David, oblivious to the tension, looked at Emily with concern. "Are you sure? You should eat something." Emily shook her head, pushing her plate away. "I'm okay. I'll just lie down after dinner." Laura watched as Emily excused herself from the table and retreated to the bedroom. The room fell silent, and Laura's heart ached as she looked at her son. She wanted so badly to believe that everything would be fine, that David was making the right choice, but the unease wouldn't leave her. David noticed her troubled expression and sighed. "Mom, please. I know you're worried, but I need you to trust me." Laura nodded, her voice soft. "I do trust you, David. I just hope you're ready for what's coming." David gave her a reassuring smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "We'll be fine, Mom. We've got this." But as Laura watched him, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was moving too fast, that something wasn't quite right. The summer heat had become relentless, seeping into every corner of the small apartment. Laura opened the kitchen window, hoping for a breeze, but the air outside felt just as stifling as it did inside. She stood at the sink, wiping her hands on a dish towel, listening to the faint murmur of voices coming from David's room. David and Emily had been living with her for a few months now, and though they tried to keep things running smoothly, there were cracks in the surface, small things Laura couldn't ignore. Emily was often in bed, claiming she was too sick to help with chores, and David, always the doting partner, never questioned her. But Laura had her doubts. More than once, she'd noticed that Emily's appetite was inconsistent, sometimes eating barely anything, other times indulging in snacks from outside. More troubling, though, was the size of Emily's belly. It hadn't changed. For someone claiming to be several months pregnant, there had been no growth. One evening, after a particularly quiet dinner where Emily had once again excused herself early, Laura sat alone at the kitchen table, deep in thought. She couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was terribly wrong. She heard the muffled sound of music coming from David's room. The house was dark, save for the light filtering in from the street outside. Laura decided to take a chance. She quietly padded down the hall and stood just outside David's room. The door was slightly ajar, and she could see Emily moving inside. Laura's breath caught in her throat when she saw Emily walking back and forth, dressed only in her underwear. But it wasn't Emily's state of undress that shocked her. It was her stomach. The bump that Emily had always shown off with pride, the supposed baby growing inside her, was gone. Laura stood frozen in the hallway, her mind racing. "Where is the baby?" she thought. She blinked, wondering if her eyes were playing tricks on her, but when Emily turned toward the bed, the truth became undeniable. Emily wasn't pregnant. Laura stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. She hurried back to the kitchen, trying to gather her thoughts. How long had this been going on? Was this all some kind of scam? And what was she supposed to tell David? Her hands trembled as she reached for a glass of water, trying to calm her nerves. Just then, Emily appeared in the doorway, looking startled to find Laura standing there. "Oh," Emily gasped, clutching a sandwich in her hand, her face pale. "I didn't see you there." Laura took a deep breath, setting the glass down on the counter. "Emily," she began, her voice low but firm, "where's the baby?" Emily's eyes widened, and for a moment she said nothing. Then she quickly recovered, flashing an uneasy smile. "What are you talking about? I told you I'm pregnant." Laura shook her head, her voice growing sharper. "I just saw you, Emily. You're not pregnant. There's no baby." Emily's face hardened, her eyes narrowing as she realized she'd been caught. She dropped the act, shrugging nonchalantly. "So you figured it out. Guess I should have been more careful." Laura's mouth dropped open in shock at her casual admission. "You've been lying to David this entire time? Why? Why would you do something like this?" Emily sighed and leaned against the doorframe, her expression turning cold. "It's simple. Without the baby, David wouldn't have taken me seriously. I needed a place to stay, and he's been more than willing to provide. I've done this before. Guys always fall for it." Laura's hands balled into fists at her sides. "How dare you? You've been lying to my son for months. You've manipulated him. Us." Emily shrugged again, her indifference infuriating Laura even more. "Look, David's a nice guy, but I didn't want to end up back in a dorm. This worked for both of us, don't you think?" "No," Laura snapped, her voice rising. "This isn't a game. You've played with his feelings. He deserves better than this." Emily rolled her eyes, clearly growing tired of the conversation. "You can lecture me all you want, but I've got everything I need. And now that you've caught me, I'll be out of here soon. But I wouldn't hold your breath on David believing you. He's completely under my spell." Laura's heart sank at the thought. She knew Emily was right. David was blind to any faults Emily had. He loved her deeply, and he wouldn't easily believe that the pregnancy had been faked. Emily turned to leave, but Laura stepped forward, her voice shaking with fury. "You're going to tell David the truth. I'm not letting you walk out of here without him knowing who you really are." Emily stopped in the doorway, a smirk tugging at her lips. "Fine, tell him. But you know what? He won't believe you. He'll think you're just trying to split us up, and by the time he figures it out, I'll be long gone." Laura stood there, trembling with rage and helplessness, as Emily walked back to David's room. She wanted to march in there, pull David aside, and force him to see the truth, But she knew it wasn't that simple. Later that night, when David returned home from work, he found his mother sitting at the kitchen table, top staring blankly at a cup of tea. Mom, you okay? David asked, concern lacing his voice. Laura looked up, her heart heavy. She couldn't keep this from him any longer. David, we need to talk. It's about Emily. David's face tensed. What about her? Is she okay? Laura hesitated for a moment, then said it bluntly. Emily isn't pregnant. David blinked, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. What are you talking about? Of course she's pregnant. We've talked about this. She's due in a few months. Laura shook her head, her voice soft but firm. I saw her, David. She's been lying. She's wearing a fake bump. David's face turned pale, and he took a step back, shaking his head. That's impossible. Emily wouldn't do that. She's been sick and tired all because of the baby. Laura reached out to him, her voice breaking. David, I know this is hard to believe, but it's the truth. She's been lying to you from the start. Please, you have to see that. David stared at her, his eyes filled with hurt and confusion. No, that's not true. Emily loves me. We're having a baby. But deep down, Laura could see the doubt beginning to creep into his mind. The truth was starting to sink in, whether he wanted to accept it or not. The tension in the house was unbearable after Laura revealed the truth to David. He spent the next several days in denial, unable to accept what his mother had told him. Emily continued to act as though nothing had changed, as if the conversation between her and Laura had never happened. But the air was thick with unspoken words, and Laura could feel the storm building, ready to break. It finally did one evening when David returned home from work. His face was pale, his movements tense as he stepped through the door. He had been distant all day, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. Laura sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of tea, while Emily lounged in the living room, pretending to watch TV. David stood in the doorway for a moment, his eyes flicking between the two women before he took a deep breath and addressed Emily. We need to talk. Emily's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing slightly. About what? David hesitated, his voice wavering. About the baby. I need to know the truth, Emily. Emily shifted uncomfortably, glancing quickly at Laura, who remained silent but watchful. David, what do you mean? I've told you everything. No, David said more forcefully this time. My mom, she told me something, and I need to hear it from you. Are you really pregnant? Emily's face hardened, and she crossed her arms defensively. Why are you listening to her? She's just trying to drive us apart. You know she never wanted us together. David's eyes flashed with pain, and he shook his head. Stop changing the subject. Just answer the question. Are you pregnant? For a moment, Emily's expression faltered, but she quickly regained her composure. David, this is ridiculous. Of course I'm pregnant. You've seen the bump. David's voice grew sharper, his patience wearing thin. Then why hasn't it grown, Emily? Why are you always hiding in the bedroom, saying you're sick, but then you're fine when you think no one's watching? I've been blind, but I'm not stupid. Tell me the truth. Emily's gaze darkened, and she stood up from the couch, walking toward him. You don't want to hear the truth, David. You just want to believe whatever your mother's feeding you. She's manipulating you. David's jaw clenched, his voice lowering to a near whisper. Enough, Emily. I deserve the truth. Emily stopped in her tracks, her eyes flashing with anger. Fine, she spat, her voice dripping with venom. You want the truth? I'm not pregnant. I never was. The words hit David like a punch to the gut. He stumbled back slightly, his face draining of color. What? He whispered, his voice barely audible. I said, I'm not pregnant, Emily repeated, her tone cold. I needed a place to stay, and I knew you'd never commit unless you thought I was carrying your baby. It worked, didn't it? David's world spun. He stared at her, his heart pounding in his chest as everything he thought he knew unraveled in front of him. You lied to me? You lied about everything? His voice cracked as he struggled to process her betrayal. Emily rolled her eyes, clearly unbothered by his anguish. Oh. Grow up, David. It's not like we were going to last anyway. You were a means to an end. Laura stood up from the kitchen table, her heart breaking for her son. Emily, how could you do this? How could you hurt him like this? She demanded, her voice shaking with emotion. Emily smirked, her cold eyes locking with Laura's. Because I could. It was easy. David's a good guy, but he's gullible. He wanted to believe in this perfect little life, and I gave him what he wanted. David's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his voice rising in desperation. I loved you. I was ready to build a life with you, and this is what you do to me? Emily shrugged, unaffected. Love's overrated, David. You'll get over it. David's eyes filled with tears, but he quickly wiped them away, refusing to let her see how deeply she had cut him. Get out, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Emily blinked, surprised by his sudden authority. What? You heard me. Get out, David repeated, his voice steadier now. I don't want you here anymore. Emily looked between him and Laura, her expression hardening. Fine, I'll leave, but don't think you'll be any better off without me. You'll regret this. David's face was etched with pain, but his resolve didn't falter. No, Emily. The only thing I regret is ever trusting you. Emily scoffed, grabbing her bag and heading toward the door. As she left, she paused in the doorway and threw one last cutting remark over her shoulder. You'll never find someone as good as me, David. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving a deafening silence in her wake. For a long moment, David stood frozen, staring at the door, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. Laura approached him cautiously, her voice soft. David. He shook his head, trying to hold back the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. She lied to me, Mom. This whole time. She lied. I know, sweetheart, Laura whispered, her heart breaking for him. David collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. How could I have been so stupid? How did I not see it? Laura sat beside him, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. You weren't stupid, David. You loved her. You wanted to believe in the future you two were planning. That's not something to be ashamed of. David's voice trembled as he spoke. I gave her everything, and she used me. She didn't care about me at all. Laura pulled him into a hug, feeling his body shake as he tried to suppress his sobs. I'm so sorry, David. I'm so sorry you had to go through this. David pulled away slightly, wiping at his eyes. I don't know what to do now. Everything feels broken. Laura looked at him with all the love and care a mother could give. You start over. You take the time to heal. And know that I'm here for you, every step of the way. David nodded slowly, though the pain in his chest still weighed him down. He didn't know how long it would take to rebuild, but as he looked at his mother's comforting face, he knew he wasn't alone. The fallout from Emily's deception had left him shattered, but he would find a way to pick up the pieces. The days following Emily's departure felt like a blur to David. The apartment, once filled with a false sense of hope and impending change, now felt eerily quiet, as if it was holding its breath. The silence echoed through the walls, amplifying the absence of the life David thought he had been building. He moved through each day like a ghost, his mind replaying Emily's betrayal over and over. How could he have been so blind? He kept asking himself that question, even though there were no answers to ease the pain. Laura watched her son with concern. She could see the toll this had taken on him. His once vibrant energy was gone, replaced by a heavy sadness that clung to him like a shadow. She gave him space, knowing he needed time to process everything, but her heart ached to reach out, to help him in any way she could. David didn't talk much in those days. He went to work, came home, and retreated to his room, shutting the door behind him. The few times Laura tried to speak with him, he gave her short, polite responses, but the distance between them felt more like an ocean now. She knew he was hurting, but she didn't want to push. One evening, after another long, quiet day, Laura decided to knock on David's door. She hesitated for a moment, not wanting to intrude, but she couldn't ignore her instinct as a mother. David? She called softly, knocking gently. There was a pause before his muffled voice responded. Yeah? Can I come in? She asked, her voice tender, as if afraid to break something fragile. Sure, came his reply, though it lacked any enthusiasm. Laura slowly opened the door and found David sitting on the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the floor. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow from the lamp casting shadows on the walls. Laura entered and sat down next to him, waiting for him to speak. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence hung in the air like an unwelcome guest. You don't have to do this, Mom, David finally said, his voice low and tired. Laura glanced at him, her heart heavy with worry. Do what? Pretend everything's going to be okay, he said, his voice cracking slightly, because right now it doesn't feel like it ever will be. Laura took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. I'm not pretending, David. He's listen, I know it feels like the world has fallen apart, and I can't imagine how much you're hurting right now. But it will get better, even if it doesn't feel like it today. David shook his head, his frustration bubbling to the surface. I just don't understand how I could have been so stupid, Mom. How did I not see it? She was lying to me the whole time, and I didn't even question it. I just, I just believed her. You're not stupid, Laura said gently, her voice full of compassion. You were in love. When you care about someone, it's easy to see what you want to see. It's not your fault she took advantage of that. David rubbed his hands over his face, sighing deeply. But I feel like it is. I feel like I let her do this to me. Laura placed a hand on his arm, squeezing gently. No, David. She's the one who lied. She's the one who used you. You're the one who trusted her. And that's not something to be ashamed of. You trusted her because you're a good person. David looked at her, his eyes filled with unshed tears. It's just, everything feels so empty now. I thought I was going to be a dad. I thought I had a future with her. And now, it's all gone. Laura's heart ached for him, but she knew there were no easy answers. I know it feels that way, but this isn't the end. It's a hard chapter, yes, but it's not the whole story. You still have so much ahead of you. David shook his head, wiping his eyes quickly. I don't even know where to start. You start by healing, Laura said softly, by taking one day at a time. You don't have to have it all figured out right now. Just take the time to breathe, to get through this, and I'll be right here, every step of the way. David let out a shaky breath, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry I didn't believe you. When you told me about Emily, I thought you were trying to control me, but you were just trying to protect me. Laura smiled sadly, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead like she used to when he was little. You don't need to apologize, David. I know you were in a tough spot. I only ever wanted what was best for you, and I always will. David nodded, his shoulders slumping with the weight of it all. I just feel so lost. Laura wrapped her arm around him, pulling him into a comforting embrace. It's okay to feel that way right now, but you're not alone. You've got me, and you've got time. Time to heal. Time to figure things out. There's no rush. For the first time in days, David allowed himself to relax into his mother's embrace, the walls he had been holding up beginning to crumble. He didn't have all the answers, and the road ahead seemed daunting. But in that moment, he realized that he wasn't completely alone. I don't know what I'd do without you, Mom, he murmured, his voice soft. You'll never have to find out, Laura whispered back, squeezing him tightly. I'm here, always. The days ahead would still be hard. There would be moments of doubt, of anger, of sadness, but for now, the silence between them was no longer oppressive. It was filled with understanding, love, and the quiet reassurance that they would get through this together, one step at a time. Weeks passed, and while the initial sting of betrayal began to fade, the scars of what Emily had done lingered. David had returned to his daily routines, work, seeing friends, but there was still a quiet sadness in him. Laura watched him closely, giving him space, but always ready to support him when he needed it. Though David never said it, she knew he was still struggling with the weight of what had happened. But healing was happening, slowly but surely. One evening, as the crisp autumn air blew outside, David sat at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Laura was cleaning up from dinner, humming quietly to herself. The peaceful moment was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. David and Laura exchanged a quick glance, neither of them expecting anyone. I'll get it, David said, standing up. He walked to the door and opened it, only to be met with a face he hadn't expected to see again, Emily. She stood in the doorway, looking different from the confident, manipulative woman he had once known. She looked tired, disheveled even, her eyes shadowed with something David couldn't quite place. There was no bump this time, no facade. It was just Emily, raw and exposed. David, she said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. Can I come in? David stared at her, every instinct telling him to shut the door, to walk away. But something stopped him. He glanced back at Laura, who had frozen in place, her eyes wide with concern. Taking a deep breath, David nodded. Come in, he said, stepping aside. Emily walked into the living room, her steps slow and uncertain. Laura stayed in the kitchen, her gaze never leaving the two of them. The tension in the air was palpable as David and Emily sat down across from each other, the silence between them thick and heavy. David finally spoke, his voice steady but distant. "Why are you here, Emily?" Emily looked down at her hands, picking at her fingernails. For a moment, it seemed like she wouldn't answer, but then she took a deep breath and looked up at him, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. "I wanted to explain." "Explain?" David echoed, his tone sharp. "You lied to me. You used me. What's left to explain?" Emily winced at his words, but she didn't back down. "I know I hurt you. I know what I did was wrong, and I've been living with that every day since I left. I didn't come here to make excuses. I came here because you deserve to hear the truth." David crossed his arms, leaning back in his chair. "The truth? You haven't told me the truth once since we met. Why should I believe anything you say now?" Emily swallowed hard, her voice breaking. "Because I'm done lying. I can't carry this anymore. David, I never meant for it to get this far. I started lying because I was scared, and then everything spiraled out of control." David's jaw tightened as he fought to keep his emotions in check. "Scared? Scared of what?" "Of being alone," Emily whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "I've spent most of my life jumping from one place to another, one person to another. I thought if I told you I was pregnant, I'd have a reason to stay. I thought you'd take care of me." David shook his head, disbelief clouding his features. "So, you used me because you were afraid of being alone?" "Yes," Emily admitted, her voice barely a whisper now. "I didn't know how to stop once I started. I convinced myself that it was for the best, that we'd be happy. But I knew it was wrong. I knew I was wrong." David stood up abruptly, his anger finally breaking through. "And you didn't care how much you were hurting me? You didn't care what kind of damage you were doing? You let me believe I was going to be a father, Emily." Emily flinched, wiping at her tears. "I know. I know what I did, and I'll never forgive myself for it. I came here because I needed you to know that I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, David. You were good to me, better than I deserved, and I ruined everything." David paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair, his thoughts tangled in the web of lies Emily had spun. Part of him wanted to scream at her, to make her feel the pain she had caused. But another part of him, a quieter part, was tired. Tired of being angry, tired of carrying the weight of her betrayal. Finally, he stopped pacing and turned to her, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't hate you, Emily, but I don't forgive you either. You need to understand that what you did wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice. You chose to lie to me. You chose to use me." Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know, and I have to live with that. I just needed you to know that I regret it." David sighed, sitting back down and leaning forward with his hands clasped. "What do you want from me, Emily?" Emily shook her head. "Nothing. I don't want anything from you. I needed to say I'm sorry. And I needed you to know that I've been trying to make things right in my own life. I don't expect anything from you. I don't deserve it." David looked at her for a long moment, the anger in him slowly dissipating, replaced by a hollow ache. "I'm glad you're trying to fix your life," he said slowly. "But that doesn't change what happened. We can't just undo the past." "I know," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't expect you to." There was a long silence between them, the only sound in the room, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Laura watched from the doorway, her heart heavy with the weight of what her son was going through. David finally stood up again, his voice soft but resolute. "You should go, Emily. We've said what needed to be said." Emily nodded, wiping her tears one last time. She stood, hesitating for a moment as if she wanted to say something more, but then she turned and walked to the door. Without looking back, she opened it and stepped out into the night. David closed the door behind her and stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle around him. Laura approached him cautiously, her voice full of concern. "David?" David exhaled slowly, turning to face her. "It's over, Mom. It's really over." Laura wrapped her arms around him, pulling him into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you, David," she whispered, "for facing her, for standing your ground." David hugged her back, the weight of the past few months finally lifting from his shoulders. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget what happened," he admitted quietly. "But I think I can move on now." Laura smiled gently, brushing a hand through his hair like she used to when he was a child. "You will," David, and you'll be stronger because of it. David nodded, feeling a sense of peace for the first time in what felt like forever. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt like he was ready to take the first step toward healing, knowing he had his mother's unwavering support. The truth had finally come to light, and though it had been painful, it had also set him free.